You know, I used to think the soundtrack of a marriage was laughter, or conversation, or maybe even the gentle silence of two people just content to be together. But for the longest time, the real soundtrack of mine was my own voice. A gentle, persistent melody of reminders, of details, of care. And the day I finally understood that my husband heard that melody not as a song of love, but as a grating, repetitive noise he called nagging, well, that was the day the foundation of everything quietly crumbled to dust. He called it nagging. I called it labor. And one day, I retired. It started with the small things. The things so small you would think they held no weight at all. They were feathers. But you live long enough you learn a pile of feathers can become a weight that sinks you. My ledger was built of feathers. I did not sit down with a pen and a fine leather book one afternoon and decide to become an accountant of our lives. It was not an ambition. It was a seepage. It was the way water finds the cracks in a foundation, not to do harm but simply because it is its nature to flow to the empty spaces. I noticed he forgot his mother's birthday the first year we were married. A simple oversight. He was a busy man starting his career. The flicker of hurt in her voice on the telephone was a tiny spark. I stamped it out with my own apology, my own assurance we would send flowers immediately. And so I remembered it the next year. I marked the calendar. I ordered the flowers. I signed the card from both of us. He was grateful. He kissed my cheek and said, "You are so good at these things." And a column was created in my invisible ledger. The column marked his family. Their joys, their sorrows, their expectations. Their preferences. His sister did not eat pork. His father hated the color yellow. His nephew was allergic to bees. These were not facts I learned for a test. They were data points I absorbed into my bloodstream because to know them was to smooth the path. To prevent the small sparks. My labor was preemptive. It was the constant gentle pressure of a thumb on a clay wheel shaping the day so it would not wobble. Then came the column of his comfort. This was not about grand gestures. It was about the silent geology of a shared life. The precise crispness of his shirt collars. Not just clean but a certain stiffness. The brand of coffee beans that he preferred, not because he ever said so but because I noticed the faint frown when I tried another. The way the pillows on his side of the bed needed to be firm, two of them, never one, never three. The newspaper folded to the business section left by his breakfast plate. These were not demands he made. They were rituals I observed and then enacted. They were the scripts I wrote for the play of our domestic life so he could walk onto the stage each day and feel everything was in its right and proper place. He never saw the script. He only experienced the flawless performance. The heaviest column was the one I titled The Unspoken. This was the ledger within the ledger. This was where I kept track of emotional debts and credits. The sigh he made when he walked in the door that meant his boss had been difficult. That required a quiet evening, a simple meal, no probing questions. The particular set of his jaw on the anniversary of his father's death. That required a specific kind of silence, a presence that was there but not intrusive, like the hum of the refrigerator, a sound only noticed when it stops. The slight coolness in his voice after he spoke to his old college friend, a coolness that hinted at some unspoken rivalry or regret. That required a redirecting of conversation to safer ground. I became a translator of silences, a navigator of moods. I charted the weather systems in his soul and I adjusted the sails of our home accordingly. Also the ship would not rock. Also he could feel steady and calm and in control. I thought this ledger was love. I truly did. I thought this meticulous attention, this devotional observation was the highest form of care. To know someone so completely that you could anticipate the need before it formed on their lips. To weave a net of such fine detail beneath them so they would never ever fall. I mistook my exhaustion for virtue. I mistook my constant mental inventory for intimacy. I thought if I could just remember everything, if I could just hold all the pieces, then the picture of our life would remain intact and beautiful. He never saw the ledger. He experienced only the outcomes. The birthday celebrated on time. The shirt that felt right against his neck. The piece of a house that seemed to run on a benevolent, effortless magic. And because he did not see the work, the calculations, the remembering, he began to believe it was effortless. He began to believe the magic was just the natural state of things. And when a magician's work looks effortless, the audience starts to believe they could do it themselves. They start to see the apparatus not as skill but as clutter. So the first time I reminded him of something for the third time because the first 2 times had been met with that absent-minded hum, the sound a man makes when he is not really listening. The first time he turned that hum into words and the words were "Stop nagging me," it was not just an insult. It was a fundamental misreading of reality. It was him looking at a master painter brushing a final delicate stroke onto a vast intricate canvas and saying, "You are making a mess." He mistook the architecture of my care for noise. He mistook the blueprint for nagging. That word, nagging, it is a small ugly word. It tries to shrink a universe of labor down to a gnat's buzz. It tries to take the weight of all those feathers, of all those columns of details and moods and histories, and dismiss it as a petty annoyance. A fly to be swatted. In that moment the ledger did not catch fire. It froze. Every entry, every carefully noted detail turned to ice. I could feel the coldness of it inside my very bones. All that warmth, all that devoted energy transformed into something brittle and heavy. And I realized the terrible truth. The ledger did not bind us together. It was not the manuscript of our love. It was a solitary confinement of my own making. I was the warden and the inmate. He was a visitor who enjoyed the tidy grounds but never inquired about the cost of their upkeep. He lived in the house that my memory built, but he believed he owned the land free and clear. So I began the quiet work of closing the accounts. Not with a dramatic slash of a pen, but by simply ceasing to make new entries. I let his mother's birthday approach without the flutter of my internal alarm. I watched the date pass on the calendar, a plain square of paper. The phone rang. I let it. I heard his confused stammering from the other room. "Oh my gosh, Mom, I'm so sorry, it just slipped my mind." The words were a strange kind of poetry. Slipped my mind. For 30 years it had not slipped my mind. It had been held firmly in the grip of my care. Now I had opened my hand. And it fell. It was the first of many falls. The coffee beans changed. I bought a blend I liked. He took a sip one morning and paused. "This tastes different," he said. "Yes," I said. And I said nothing more. I did not explain. I did not apologize. I did not rush to correct it. I simply let the difference exist in the space between us. A small stone of a new reality. The pillow configuration shifted. One night there was only one pillow on his side. He fluffed it and settled in. He survived. The world did not end. The sky did not fall. One by one I stopped feeding the columns. I stopped translating the silences. I let his moods move through the house like weather without me building an emotional arc. I let him be responsible for the climate of his own soul. And as I withdrew my labor, as I retired from that ceaseless invisible administration, a strange thing happened. The ledger began to fade. The ink of all those years of meticulous attention began to pale. I could no longer recall his nephew's best friend's name. I forgot which of his colleagues he found tiresome. The specific model of tire he preferred for the car, it vanished from my mind like smoke. It was not malice. It was liberation. My mind was clearing out a storage room packed to the ceiling with the artifacts of his existence to make space for air, for light, for the possibility of my own thoughts. The final entry in that old ledger was not about him at all. It was a single line written in my own heart. It said, "I am tired of being the keeper of all the things that no one else values enough to keep." And so I closed the book. I placed it gently on a high shelf in the library of my past. It is up there still. A relic. A testament to a kind of love that was really a kind of servitude. A love that asked me to disappear into the details. A love that called my devotion nagging. A love that could not see the monumental labor in the mundane because it was never meant for his eyes. It was meant to make his world frictionless. And when you make a world frictionless for someone, you also make it utterly forgettable. You make yourself the ghost in the machine. And one day you have to choose whether to haunt a house that is no longer your home, or to finally quietly step out into the sun and feel your own weight, your own solid wonderful weight upon the earth. The deepest labor is the labor you do before anyone knows there is work to be done. It is the labor of anticipation. It is the quiet mapping of needs before they become spoken demands. It is standing at the shoreline of another person's life, watching the horizon for storms they haven't yet seen. For 30 years I was a meteorologist of his moods, a cartographer of his comfort, a strategist of his peace. I did not wait for the crisis. I lived in the perpetual gentle tension of averting it. This was my true work. The scrubbing of floors was just the visible punctuation at the end of a very long invisible sentence. It began with time, not my time, his time, the management of his minutes. I held the shape of his day in my mind before he ever opened his eyes. I knew the meeting at 10 would run long, so dinner should be flexible. I knew the drive to his mother's took 47 minutes, not 30, so I would begin the subtle choreography of leaving 15 minutes before he thought we should. I was the silent clock behind the clock. I absorbed the friction of tardiness, the anxiety of forgetting, so he could move through his hours with the illusion of seamlessness. I was the buffer between him and the consequences of his own inattention. A wife is many things, they say. I was a living, breathing grace period. Then there was the emotional forecasting. A man's silence is not an empty room. It is a chamber full of echoes. I learned to distinguish the echoes. The short, tight silence after a phone call with his brother that meant old rivalries had stirred. That silence required distance. It needed me to become a ghost in my own home, moving quietly, offering no demands for conversation. The heavier, gloomier silence that settled after a professional disappointment. That silence required a specific sustenance. A meal that comforted without celebration. Meatloaf, not steak. The old blue shirt, not a new one. It required me to hold space without filling it. To be present as a soft chair is present. Available but not asking anything. And the rare bright silence of contentment, usually after a good round of golf. That one I could gently interrupt. That was the silence where I could say a small thing about my own day and it might actually be heard. I became a student of his atmospheric pressure. My own inner barometer rose and fell with his. My joy was often just the relief that his storms had passed. My own weather was a secondary consideration, a small local forecast in the corner of the screen. The labor of anticipation is a thief of the present moment. You cannot be here now when you are constantly living in the next 5 minutes, the next 5 hours. While he sat watching television, I was not watching television. I was seeing the empty milk carton in the refrigerator and calculating if it would last for breakfast, knowing the grocery store would be closed by the time the show ended. I was hearing the faint rattle in the furnace and mentally scheduling a service call for a time he would not be home to be inconvenienced. I was feeling the approach of his mother's visit a week away and already planning menus that would please her, stocking the guest towels she preferred, folding them in the precise way she found correct. My body might be on the sofa, but my mind was a scout sent days into the future, scanning for obstacles and smoothing the path for his passage. And the greatest burden of this labor is its fundamental invisibility. When you anticipate perfectly, when you smooth the wrinkle before it forms, there is no evidence you ever did a thing. The catastrophe that did not happen leaves no mark to be praised. The frustration he never felt because you quietly removed its cause cannot be thanked. You become the architect of an absence. The absence of hassle, the absence of drama, the absence of need, and when you are too good at your job you build your own invisibility. He lived in the house of my anticipation. He enjoyed the comfort of its temperature-controlled climate. He never once asked who built the walls or who maintained the foundation. He simply expected it to be there. A law of nature, gravity, oxygen, a wife who makes life easy. That was the word he used. Easy. He would tell his friends, she makes everything so easy. He meant it as the highest compliment. I heard it as my epitaph. It erased the mountain of cognitive and emotional labor it took to produce that effortless easy. It collapsed a lifetime of vigilance into a personality trait. She is just an easygoing woman. Not a woman who kills herself to manufacture ease for you. And so when the friction did occur, when a rare wrinkle slipped through my preventive net, his reaction was never gratitude for all the wrinkles I had smoothed. It was annoyance that this one existed. A flat tire became my failure for not anticipating the wear. A missed appointment was my nagging for not reminding him with enough urgency. His comfort had become his entitlement. My anticipation had become my duty. And duty performed perfectly is punished by the raising of the standard. You were expected to see the unseen coming. You were blamed for the storm you could not stop because you have stopped all the others. The day I retired from this labor was not a day I announced. It was a day I simply sat down inside my own mind. I let the scout come home. I stopped sending her out. I recall the moment with a clarity that stills me. He was leaving for a weekend fishing trip with Friends. For years the ritual was the same. I would lay out the appropriate clothes, check the weather, pack the sunscreen, find the favorite rod and reel in the garage, quietly slip cash into his duffel bag so he wouldn't have to stop at the bank. This time I did nothing. I watched him bustle about. I heard him muttering, "Where's my green tackle box? Did it rain last week or the boots dry?" I sat at the kitchen table. I drank my tea. I felt the old internal strings pull, the urgent puppet strings of care that screamed he needs his waterproof jacket, it's in the hall closet. I did not move. I drank my tea. He left. He forgot the jacket. He forgot the sunscreen. He had to stop for cash. He returned sunburned and a little sour. "The trip was fine," he said. "But you could have reminded me about that jacket." The old words were there on my tongue. The apology, the smoothing over. I swallowed them. They were bitter and they were mine. I looked at him not with anger but with a vast tired curiosity. "You are a grown man," I said. And my voice was so quiet it was almost the sound of the light falling through the window. "You have eyes. You have a brain that forecasts weather for multi-million-dollar projects. Did you not think to look at the sky?" The silence that followed was not one of his silences. It was a new silence. A silence where the background hum of my anticipation had stopped and the room was left with only the truth of its own emptiness. He had no answer because the answer was unacceptable. He had never had to think about the sky where I was. I had always been his atmosphere. From that day the labor changed. Or rather, I stopped offering it. I began to live in the present, my own present. When a thought about his future need entered my mind, I acknowledged it and let it pass like a cloud. I did not grab it and build a task around it. I started asking a revolutionary question. Is this my need or his? If it was his, I let it lie. Let him discover it. Let him feel the mild discomfort of its absence. It was not punishment. It was education. It was the withdrawal of a service he had never contracted for but had come to see as his birthright. I began to anticipate my own needs instead. What did I want to eat? When did I need rest? What brought me a quiet moment of joy? I became my own scout. I sent my mind ahead to map a path for my peace. I forecast my own emotional weather and tended to it with the devotion I had once lavished on his. The house became different, less perfectly attuned to him. A little cooler, a little warmer at my preference. The meals simpler, geared toward my taste. The silence no longer charged with my listening for his cues but filled instead with my own thoughts or with the music I chose. The friction returned to his life. Small frictions, missing socks, empty gas tanks, unremembered birthdays. He floundered in it. He was a man who had forgotten how to swim because he had always been carried. And in that floundering I saw the final truth. The labor of anticipation is not love. It is a form of control. A beautiful benevolent cage built to keep another person comfortable and oneself indispensable. It is a way of saying you cannot manage without me while secretly fearing I have no purpose without your need. Letting go of that labor was not an act of neglect. It was an act of profound respect. For him and for myself. It was saying I respect you enough to believe you can learn to see the storms on your own horizon. And I respect myself enough to stop living in the forecast of another person's life. The weather in here in my own heart is calm now. It is finally and wonderfully my own. It wasn't a woman. I want you to understand that. It wasn't a grand passion or a secret life or a second family hidden across town. Those are tragedies, with a shape. They have a villain you can name, a story you can tell. What happened to me was quieter. It was an erasure, a slow fading out until I became a ghost in my own home. The moment I knew it was absolute was not in a confrontation. It was on a Wednesday. A perfectly ordinary Wednesday. The plumber was scheduled. I had told him twice. Once when I made the appointment with a cheerful "they'll be here between 2 and 4 next Wednesday." And once that morning a gentle "remember the plumber is coming today." He gave me that sound. Not a word. A hum. The hum a man makes when a fly is near his ear. A sound of distracted dismissal. Later his key was in the door at 5:15. I was in the kitchen. He walked in and saw the vase on the floor, the old pipes exposed, the toolbox. He stopped, his face clouded with a genuine confusion. Was someone here? He asked. And I said the plumber. He came, and he sighed, that long weary sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 such sighs. He put his briefcase down with a soft thud of finality. "All right," he said. "All right. I heard you the first time. I heard you the first time." Those 6 words were the key that unlocked a door I had been leaning against for 30 years. The door swung open and I saw the vast empty landscape of his not seeing. It was not that he forgot the plumber. It was that the information my voice carried held no weight. It was noise, background static, the hum of an appliance you stop hearing until it shuts off. My reminders, the careful architecture of my communication designed to keep our life functioning, were to him just nagging. A persistent unimportant buzzing, and in that moment I did not feel anger. I felt a cold clear clarity. This was the truth. He did not hear me. He had not been hearing me. My voice, my careful attentive voice, had become the soundtrack of his inconvenience. You build a life with someone brick by brick. You believe you are building a cathedral. You are so careful with your mortar. You choose each brick with love. You stand side by side in the sun and the rain. And then one day you step back to look at what you've made and you see he has been standing in a different place the whole time. He has been building a simple sturdy shed. A functional space. And all your ornate carvings, your careful arches, your stained glass windows, they are not on his walls. They never were. He looks at your cathedral and he sees a shed with some odd unnecessary decoration. He doesn't hate the decoration. He just doesn't understand its purpose. He wishes sometimes it would be quieter so he could enjoy the simplicity of his shed. The plumber was just a brick. But when it fell I saw the whole structure was wrong. I had been speaking cathedral. He had been hearing shed. This was the real betrayal. Not of my body but of my reality. My perception of our life was a shared document. A contract we both signed and worked from. I discovered then that he had been reading a different contract. In my contract my voice was the gentle coordinator, the loving facilitator. In his contract my voice was a managerial overhead, a cost of doing business in the domestic sphere. Something to be minimized, tolerated, silenced if possible. I began to listen back. To listen to the silence that followed my words. I had always been so busy planning the next thing to say, the next reminder, the next piece of smooth coordination, that I never listened to what came after. The empty space. The lack of engagement. The way a question would hang in the air like a dust mote and then simply settle unanswered. "What do you think about painting the porch?" Silence. The clatter of a newspaper. Not a dismissal. Just nothing. As if I had spoken in a language he did not know. I had trained myself to fill those silences, to answer my own questions, to make my own decisions and just present them for a rubber stamp. I had mistaken his indifference for trust. "You decide, dear, you're better at those things." That wasn't trust. That was outsourcing. He had made me the CEO of a company he owned but took no interest in until the profits dipped. The real pain was not the not listening. It was the realization of what he was not hearing. He was not hearing the woman who could talk about a book with shining eyes. He was not hearing the girl who had opinions about politics or the color of the sky or the meaning of a song. He was hearing a system alert. A notification. Wife.x is requesting your attention. Task. Acknowledge plumber. Task. Confirm dinner. Task. Provide emotional response. And his setting was set to snooze. Indefinitely. I stopped being a wife then. In my heart, I became an anthropologist. I observed the native in his habitat. I noted his customs. His language consisted of grunts and sighs and the word fine. His rituals involved the couch, the remote, the glass of something amber. His needs were simple and predictable. Food, silence, a clean shirt. My voice was an environmental factor. Like rain on the roof. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes not, but never something to truly engage with. Never a weather system to be understood. I decided to run an experiment. I would speak only in facts about myself. Small personal truths, not requests, not reminders, just evidence of my own interior life. I had a dream about the ocean last night. Silence. I read an article that made me think of my father. The turn of a page. My knee is aching with the coming rain. A glance at the window. Not at me, at the weather. My voice was not connecting. It was hitting a wall, a smooth polished surface of his self-containment and sliding right off. I was speaking to a closed door. I had been speaking to a closed door for decades and decorating the doorframe believing I was building a house. The final test was silence. My own silence. I ceased the notifications altogether. The house grew so quiet you could hear the clock tick in a way that felt loud and intrusive. The first few days he seemed relieved. The buzzing had stopped. He moved through his shed unimpeded. Then the forgotten things piled up. The empty milk carton, the missed haircut, the unpaid ticket. He would discover these absences, these small failures of his system. He would look at me. A question in his eyes. Why didn't you? But he could not form the words. Because to form them would be to admit he depended on the buzzing. That the background noise was in fact the signal. He would simply sigh and deal with it himself with a clumsy frustration. Each sigh was a confession. He missed my nagging. He missed the labor. He just didn't want to pay for it with his attention. That is when the grief came. A quiet vast ocean of it. I grieved for the woman I had been. The one who thought her voice was a thread in a tapestry. I saw now I had been talking to myself. Weaving a tapestry alone in a room while he sat in the next room listening to the radio. The connection I felt, the intimacy of shared detail, was a phantom limb. It had never been there. I realized my voice had grown small over the years to match his listening. I had become an expert in the concise update, the efficient question. I had pruned my thoughts into bullet points so as not to burden him. I had stopped telling long stories, stopped sharing wandering thoughts. I had made myself a briefing. And now even the briefing was too long. So I took my voice back. Not to use on him. He had shown me it was a barren field. Nothing would grow there. I took it back for myself. In the car alone I would talk. I would say the long meandering things. I would talk about the ocean dream in detail, the color of the water, the feeling of the sand. I would argue with the radio. I would sing old songs with the wrong words loudly. I began a journal, and in it my voice exploded. It was messy and emotional and full of questions that had no answers. It was not efficient. It was alive. Sometimes now I catch him looking at me. A strange look. Puzzled. I will be sitting perfectly silent writing in my book or just looking out the window at the birds. And he will look up and it's as if he has just noticed a stranger in the room. A quiet, peaceful stranger who does not buzz. And I think he is wondering where the noise went. He is wondering what this new silence means. He misses the notification. He does not miss me. He misses the function. And my silence now is deeper and more powerful than my words ever were. Because it is not a silence waiting to be broken. It is a silence that is complete unto itself. It is the sound of me leaving a room he has never actually entered. It is the soft click of a door closing inside my own soul. He is on the other side of it. And for the first time I am not. I am here, in the quiet, and the quiet is mine. It was a withdrawal so silent you would have needed special instruments to hear it. Not the sound of a door slamming but the sound of a door being left open so the heat slowly leaks out. I did not announce my resignation. I did not hand in a letter. One day I simply stopped attending the daily meetings in my own mind, the strategic briefings for the maintenance of his world. I stepped away from the control panel. I watched the lights blink one by one into standby mode. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of a space that finally belonged to me. The first thing I released was his calendar. I had been the keeper of time, the secretary of his commitments, the human alarm for his obligations. I set down that burden. It was a physical sensation, a lightness in my shoulders I had not known was heavy. When his brother's birthday circled on the wall calendar, I looked at it as one looks at a historical date. Something that happened once. I did not buy a card. I did not suggest a gift. I let the day dawn and fade. The phone rang that evening. I heard his confused joviality in the other room, the strained laughter. "Oh man, I am so sorry, it just slipped my mind." He came into the kitchen after the call, his face a mix of annoyance and bewilderment. "You didn't remind me about Paul's birthday," he said. It was an accusation, soft but firm. I was stirring a pot of soup for myself. I looked at him. "No," I said. "I didn't." And I went back to stirring. The silence that hung between us was new. It was the silence of a lapsed treaty. He stood there waiting for the apology, the explanation, the familiar flutter of corrective action. It did not come. It was the first time he experienced the natural gravitational pull of his own responsibilities. He had grown weightless in the atmosphere of my memory. Next I relinquished the emotional forecasting. I let his moods be his own weather. I stopped reading the clouds in his eyes. I stopped adjusting my own atmospheric pressure to compensate for his storms. When he came home with that tight-closed look, the one that usually meant a bad day and required a quiet house, a gentle meal, I simply said hello. I did not ask what was wrong. I did not tiptoe. I played the music I wanted to hear at a volume that pleased me. I cooked garlic which he disliked but I loved. The air was thick with its scent. He sat at the table adrift. He was waiting for the interrogation, the careful drawing out of his trouble. It never came. He ate in a silence that was his own, not one I was holding for him. His bad mood had nowhere to land. It stayed with him, a suit he had to wear alone. I watched him realize it. Watched him feel the unfamiliar burden of his own discontent. Before I had always carried half. Now I set my half down. The physical space of the house began to change. Not dramatically, subtly, a shift in the axis. I cleared the mantelpiece of the trophies from his golf tournaments. I put there instead a single smooth stone I had found on a walk. I moved my reading chair to the best spot by the window where the light fell in the afternoon. His chair was still there, still his. But it was no longer the throne of the house. It was just a chair in a different part of the room. I stopped fluffing its cushions. I stopped clearing his newspapers from its arms. They piled up like geological strata. I did not clean around them. I let his space become his. Messy, unordered his. My space became clean, simple mine. The house became a map of two separate countries. I stopped being the curator of his family. His mother would call. I would let the machine answer. Elizabeth, it's Marian, call me back. I would not call back. She would call his phone. He would have to remember to return her call. He would have to listen to her stories, her complaints, her endless gentle critiques. He began to understand the weight of that relationship, the weight I had carried for him as a buffer. One Sunday he came out of his study looking drained. My mother, he said. She talks for an hour and says nothing. I nodded. I said nothing. My silence was a vast continent between us. He was on the shore, realizing for the first time the ocean he had asked me to sail for him every week. The money. I opened my own account. A small thing, a quiet rebellion. I had my own social security check, a modest thing from years of a job before children. I had always funneled it into the household. Into groceries, into curtains, into gifts for his family. I redirected it. I opened the account online. The process was simple. A few clicks. When the debit card arrived, a plain blue rectangle, I held it in my hand. It felt like a key. Not to a door but to a room inside myself I had locked long ago. I began to buy small things. A book he would not appreciate. An expensive tea. A subscription to a magazine filled with art. These were not acts of spite. They were acts of reintegration. I was taking the scattered pieces of myself I had spent on them and buying them back one by one. The meals were the most profound change. I stopped cooking for a man. I cooked for a woman. For me. I made soups full of vegetables he called rabbit food. I made spicy dishes that cleared my sinuses and made him reach for water. I set one place at the table. I ate when I was hungry. He would wander in at 7 or 8 and look at the clean stove, the empty counter. "What's for dinner?" he would ask. And I would say from my seat at my one place setting, "I'm not sure. I've already eaten." The first few times he laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then he grew puzzled. Then frustrated. He would open the refrigerator and stare into its bright, cool interior as if the answer were hidden behind the milk. He saw ingredients, not meals. He saw the raw components of labor. He had never learned the language of them. I had always been the translator. Now I was silent. I withdrew my body, not from intimacy that was long gone, but from the casual geography of a shared life. I did not make room for him on the sofa. I stayed in my spot. If he wanted to sit, he had to navigate around me. I stopped sleeping in the same bed. I did not announce it. I simply began spending my evenings in the guest room reading. One night I just stayed. I closed the door. The bed was smaller, the pillows were different. I slept a sleep so deep it felt like sinking into a warm, dark sea. He never asked about it. I think he preferred the sprawl. But the message was sent. A new border had been drawn. All this time I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not explain. I simply stepped back. I created a distance of 1 foot, then 2, then a whole room. I vacated the position I had held for a lifetime. The position of manager of his existence. And in that vacancy he began to flounder. He missed appointments. He wore mismatched socks. The house developed a faint layer of dust in his spaces. The bills piled up unopened. He lived in the chaos of his own inattention. And he could not blame me. Because I was so quiet. Because I was still there, physically present but administratively absent. He would look at me with a question in his eyes, a silent "Why aren't you?" But the question died before it reached his lips. Because to ask it would be to admit the scope of what I had done for him. To give voice to the silence would be to give it a power he did not want to acknowledge. My withdrawal was my final and greatest act of communication. It was the only language he had forced me to learn. The language of absence. I spoke it fluently. I said with my empty stove, "I will not sustain you." I said with my separate account, "I am my own country." I said with my closed door, "My peace is not negotiable." He heard every word of it. He heard it in the growl of his stomach at 8 p.m. He heard it in the late fee on the car registration. He heard it in the puzzled hurt on his mother's voice when he finally remembered to call. He heard it in the vast echoing quiet of a house where the comforting hum of wifely labor had ceased. And I began to fill my own silence with myself. I took long walks and listened not to podcasts but to the sound of my own breath. I sat for hours with a single cup of tea and thought long meandering thoughts that went nowhere and everywhere. I remembered girlhood dreams. I allowed myself whims. I bought a sketchbook and drew terrible drawings that brought me joy. The energy I had spent on anticipating his needs, on smoothing his path, I poured back into the cracked and parched soil of my own spirit. It was not an angry withdrawal. It was a sad one. A necessary one, like slowly taking back a loan you had never meant to give. A piece of your soul you had handed over thinking it was a gift, but it was only ever a debt. I was calling in the debt. Not with a lawsuit but with a quiet, relentless repossession of my own time, my own attention, my own life. He is still there, in his house, among the dust and the mismatched socks and the silent phone. And I am here, in my silence, which is no longer an emptiness but a sanctuary. I withdrew from his world. And in doing so I finally arrived in my own. The border is closed, the quiet is absolute, and it is mine. When you retire they give you a pension. A sum of money for the years you gave to the labor. A recognition that your time, your energy, your life had a value, and that value must be honored when the active work is done. No one gave me a pension. No gold watch. No luncheon in a conference room with sheet cake. So I had to claim it myself. I had to become my own benefactor, my own grateful company. My pension wasn't a check. It was myself returned to me. It was the quiet dividends of my own undivided attention. It was the compound interest of all the minutes and hours I had invested in him, now finally paid out to the original shareholder. Me. The first installment was time. Pure, unfiltered, uninterrupted time. I claimed the early mornings. For 30 years I rose with the sun to start the machinery of his day. The coffee, the toast, the packing of a lunch he often didn't eat. Now I rose when my body wished to. Sometimes in the dark stillness. Sometimes letting the sun climb high and warm the sheets. I would sit in the quiet kitchen, not with a list in my head but with a cup of something warm, and just look out the window. I watched the light change. I saw the neighbor's cat slink along the fence. I noticed the way the leaves on the maple tree turned from black to green as the sun touched them. I was not waiting for the next task. I was simply present in the minutes. They stretched out before me, long and languid, like a country road with no destination. This was my pension, this luxurious unclaimed time. It felt sinful at first. Then it felt like justice. Next I claimed my own mind. I stopped the internal radio station that played nothing but the soundtrack of his needs. I changed the channel. I let my thoughts wander where they would. They wandered to strange places. To memories of a grandfather's farm, to the plot of a novel I read at 20, to the question of why geese fly in that particular shape. My thoughts became unruly and beautiful. They were no longer efficient bullet points for the management of a household. They were poetry and nonsense and quiet wonder. I began to read again. Not books I thought I should read, but books I wanted to read. Mysteries with dog-eared pages. Thick histories of places I would never see. Poetry that made my throat tight with a feeling I could not name. I fed my mind with what it craved, not what was practical. This too was my pension. The intellectual freedom to be curious about my own curiosities. I claimed a new geography of the body. For so long my body had been an instrument of service. Hands that cooked and cleaned. Arms that held. A face that arranged itself into expressions of calm understanding. I retired it from that service. I began to listen to its whispers. The ache in my knee that asked for a slower walk, not a push through the pain. The desire to stretch in the afternoon like a cat simply for the pleasure of it. I ran a hot bath in the middle of the day for no reason. I used the expensive salts. I soaked until my fingers pruned. I lotioned my own skin with a care I had once reserved for fine furniture. I bought a soft sweater in a color he would have said was impractical, a color like a ripe apricot. I wore it around the house because the touch of it against my skin gave me a simple animal comfort. My body was no longer a tool for the comfort of others. It was my home again. Tended to, cherished, listened to. This sensual reclamation was a direct deposit into my pension fund. My pension was the right to my own preferences. The small sovereign choices that define a person. The volume of the music. The thickness of the soup. The temperature of a room. For decades my preferences had been negotiated away, absorbed into the greater project of his ease. I liked the house cool. He liked it warm. The house was warm. I loved the sharp tang of a good mustard. He found it overpowering. The mustard was mild. Now I let the night air flood the bedroom. I slept under a heavy blanket in the delicious chill. I bought a jar of mustard so strong it made my eyes water. I slathered it on sandwiches he would never see. I reveled in the sheer selfishness of it. The unapologetic ownership of my own taste. Each choice was a coin dropped into my account, a small affirmation of my own existence. The most valuable part of my pension was emotional solitude. The profound peace of being responsible for no one's happiness but my own. I had been the emotional shock absorber for an entire family. Every bump in the road vibrated through me. I softened the blows for everyone else. Now I removed the apparatus. I let them feel the road. It was not cruelty. It was honesty. And for myself I built a quiet room inside my spirit, a room with very soft walls. No one's disappointment could pierce it. No one's sour mood could stain the air. My own sadness, my own joys lived there in their pure, uncomplicated state. If I felt like crying, I cried. Not as a performance, not as a manipulation. Just as a weather that passed through me. If I felt a sudden flicker of joy at the sight of a bird on the windowsill, I smiled. I did not have to explain it or translate it or filter it through his potential reaction. My emotions became my own private landscape to tend. This emotional autonomy was the cornerstone of my retirement fund. It was the interest that compounded daily. I claimed my name, not the name I had taken, not the title of Mrs., not the role of wife or mother or daughter-in-law. I whispered my own name to myself. The name I was born with. The name that belonged to the girl I was before I became an archive. Elizabeth. It sounded foreign on my own tongue at first. Then it sounded like a secret. Then it sounded like a truth. Elizabeth likes the rain. Elizabeth prefers the window seat. Elizabeth is tired. Elizabeth is content. I began to make sentences with my own name at the center. This was the language of my pension. The language of self. I did not hoard this new wealth. I spent it freely on myself. I spent time on long aimless drives down country roads with the windows open. I spent attention on learning the names of the birds that came to the feeder. I spent care on making a perfect loaf of bread just for the smell of it filling my kitchen. I spent silence on entire afternoons with no sound but the turning of a page and my own steady breath. He saw me living on this pension. He saw the serenity it brought me. The unflappable calm. The soft smile that played on my lips for no reason he could discern. It confused him. It angered him sometimes. My peace felt like an accusation. My contentment was a room he could not enter. He would make little comments. "You seem different. Or you're very quiet these days." I would just nod. I would not explain. My pension was none of his business. It was the payoff from a career of labor he had never acknowledged. He had no claim to it. One evening he stood in the doorway of the living room. I was in my chair by the good lamp reading. The apricot sweater around my shoulders. A cup of that strong tea steaming beside me. He had just discovered another unpaid bill. His face was lined with a frustration that was edging toward despair. He looked at me surrounded by my simple evident peace. He saw the closed circle of my contentment. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to blame, probably to demand. But his eyes took in the scene. The woman calm in her pool of light. The world she had built for one. The door to that world was clearly marked private. He closed his mouth. He turned and walked away. That was the moment I knew my pension was secure. It was vested. It could not be taken away. I had performed the ultimate act of financial planning for my soul. I had saved for my own rainy day. I had diversified the assets of my heart away from the single volatile stock of his approval. I had built a portfolio of small joys, private moments, self-knowledge. And now I was living off the returns. The returns were peace. The returns were a slow, unbreaking smile. The returns were the deep, solid knowing that I was, for the first time since I was a very young girl, the sole beneficiary of my own life. I was writing the checks to myself. And I was signing them in the bold, clear handwriting of a woman who finally knows her own name and her own worth. The pension was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a life lived on my own terms, funded by the currency of my own hard-won freedom. Every quiet morning, every chosen book, every moment of simple unshared pleasure was a dividend. And I collected them all with the deep, grateful knowing that I had earned every single cent. The final act of my retirement was not something I did. It was something I allowed. I allowed him to forget. I released the safety net I had woven over 30 years from threads of memory and care and anticipation. I watched him step out onto the tightrope of his own life without it. And I did not whisper a warning. I did not point to the place where he might slip. I stood silent on the solid ground I had claimed for myself, and I observed the natural, inevitable physics of inattention. This was not revenge. Revenge is an active, hot thing. This was colder. This was simply the removal of a buffer. It was allowing reality to teach the lessons I had spared him from for a lifetime. It was the liberation of letting him fail. It began with the small domestic amnesias. The empty roll of toilet paper left on the spindle. The milk carton placed back in the refrigerator light as a feather. The trash can overflowing with his discarded wrappers. Before I would have sighed and replaced and taken out. Now I left them. I used the guest bathroom. I drank my tea black. I let the trash spill onto the floor. I allowed the consequences to accumulate like dust. He would discover these minor crises with a grunt of annoyance, a vague sense that the world was out of order. He would look at me expecting to see the old readiness, the old spring of corrective action. He saw instead a woman looking back at him with a calm, passive face, a mirror reflecting his own neglect. He had to solve it. He had to find the new rolls in the closet, he had to smell the sour milk, he had to gather the spilled trash with his own hands. Each small task was a revelation, an education in the thousand invisible things that had kept his world frictionless. The larger forgettings carried more weight. His niece's wedding shower. I had the invitation pinned to the bulletin board for 2 months. I said nothing. The day came and went. His sister called, furious. He was in his study. I heard the raised voice through the door, the defensive sputter. He emerged later, pale with the heat of shame. You knew about that, he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. Yes, I said. I did. And I returned to my book. The silence that followed was thick with his dawning comprehension. My knowing was no longer a service to him. It was now merely a private fact. A fact I was no longer in the business of sharing. I allowed him to bear the full brunt of his sister's anger, the full weight of his niece's disappointment. I did not soften it with my apologies or my explanations. I let it be his failure, his consequence. It was the first time he truly felt the social cost of his own inattention. It left a mark. I allowed him to forget appointments with the dentist, the mechanic, the tax man. I allowed the reminder cards to pile up unopened on his desk. I allowed the late fees to accrue. I allowed the disconnection notice for the cable to arrive. He came home one evening to a dark, silent television. What the hell, he muttered, pushing buttons on a dead remote. I sat knitting under the lamplight. I believe the bill wasn't paid, I said, my voice as neutral as a news report. He scrambled for the bill, found it under a stack of other unopened envelopes, paid it online with a grumble. The service returned, but something had shifted. The infrastructure of his leisure had broken down because of his own neglect. He had experienced a direct link between his action and his comfort. It was a link I had always disguised. The most profound thing I allowed him to forget was me. Not my presence but my history, my preferences, my inner life. He would tell a story about our past and get the details wrong. The color of the car we had the year we went to the beach, the name of the restaurant. Before I would have gently corrected him, a soft no dear, it was the blue Chevy. Now I let the false story stand. I let him build a past out of faulty lumber. It was his past now, not ours. He would offer me a food he had forgotten I disliked. I would say no thank you. I would not remind him of the reason. I allowed his mental model of me to grow outdated and inaccurate. I became a stranger in my own home, a woman he realized he no longer knew because he had stopped the labor of knowing. The shock on his face when I would decline a food or reference a memory he didn't share was a quiet earthquake. He was living with a ghost, a pleasant ghost whose outlines he could no longer trace. I allowed the silence between us to become permanent. I did not fill it with chatter. I did not paper it over with the wallpaper of wifely conversation. I let it be a vast empty plain between two people. He would sometimes try to cross it. He would make a comment about the weather or the news. I would nod or offer a brief polite reply. I did not build a bridge from my side. I allowed the distance to remain. He had to do all the work of crossing, and when he arrived he found no welcoming committee, just a quiet woman at peace in her own territory. He began to stop trying. The silence solidified. It became the true architecture of our relationship. And in that silence he had to hear the echoes of his own loneliness. It was a loneliness of his own making. I had been his echo for years, reflecting back a version of his world that was fuller than it was. Now I was silent and the hollow truth rang out. I allowed him to feel the full weight of his choices. The choice to ignore, the choice to dismiss, the choice to outsource the emotional and logistical labor of his life. When the weight became uncomfortable he would look at me with an expectation that I would lift it. My stillness was my answer. The weight was his. I would not lift it. This was the core of my liberation. I was no longer the shock absorber. I let every bump jar him. I let every pothole rattle his bones. He grew tired. He grew irritable. He grew old in a way I had not seen before. The burden of managing a single life, his own, was wearing him down. He was a man who had never carried his own luggage, suddenly finding it heavy and awkward in his hands. And through it all I felt a profound and terrible peace. I was not causing his distress. I was merely ceasing to prevent it. I was allowing nature to take its course. A garden untended will grow weeds. A house untended will gather dust. A life untended will accumulate consequences. I had been the full-time gardener, the housekeeper, the personal assistant to his existence. I retired. I allowed the weeds, the dust, the chaos to teach him what I could not. That these things did not happen by magic. That order had a cost. That care was a currency he had spent without knowing its value. The ultimate liberation was watching him learn or fail to learn. It was releasing the outcome. His happiness was no longer my project. His comfort was no longer my key performance indicator. I had divorced myself from the results of his life. It was the greatest detachment. It felt like floating, like being untethered from a sinking ship and watching it from the safe, steady shore. He is still there in the house of his own forgetting. I see him sometimes, a puzzled man looking for his glasses on his head, holding a bill he doesn't understand. There is no triumph in my heart. Only a quiet confirmation. This was the man I had married. This was the man who had been there all along underneath the infrastructure I had built for him. This was his true shape. And my final gift to myself was to stop shaping him. To stop editing his reality. To let him be exactly what he was, a man who forgot things. And my final gift to him, though he will never see it as a gift, was to let him live in the unedited version of his own life. To let him feel the chill of his own neglect. To let him taste the blandness of a meal he had not thought to plan. I liberated us both. I liberated him from the illusion of a wife who would forever absorb the shocks of his inattention. And I liberated myself from the tyranny of a responsibility that was never truly mine. All I did was step aside. All I did was allow gravity to work. All I did was let him fall, the small necessary falls that teach a creature how to walk. And in that allowing I found my own solid ground. My own 2 feet planted firmly beneath me. No longer bracing for his stumble. No longer reaching to catch him. Just standing, still, finally still, and the ground beneath me was mine.